Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Meenal Dhal from Department of Anthropology, University of Delhi. Today we will discuss about the module Adaptation of Ecological Stress Temperature, Latitude and Altitude from the paper Ecological Anthropology, Cultural and Biological Dimension. Now this module covers the following learning objectives. The first one is to summarize the ecological rules, then describe the standard temperature trials and acclimatization to temperature. We'll also describe the adaptation of hypoxia and organ system adaptation, and then we'll describe or discuss the various facets of individual adaptation to hypoxia, and lastly we'll explain the population adaptation to hypoxia. So in this module we will focus only on the aspects of adaptation that is of interest to anthropologists. This aspect comprises genetic adaptation that are characteristics of group of people, some of whose phenotypes better suited to environment were produced as a matter of natural selection. The restriction of this module only to heat and altitude stress would be arbitrary, since most of the population undergoes cold stress on a seasonal or diurnal basis. The primary problem for man in hot environment is heat dissipation, and there are no major racial differences in the physiological mechanism involved in dissipating the heat. Man relies on convection and radiation forms of heat loss upon the point when the surrounding air and objects become hotter than the skin. The adjustment of heat loss is accomplished by altering the flow of blood through the capillary bed of the skin by vasodilation. Vasodilation, it is the widening of the blood vessel to increase the blood flow and result in the loss of heat. And another is vasoconstriction. Constriction is narrowing of the blood vessel and reduction in the blood flow, which results in the decrease in the loss of heat. Now while exercising, heat is lost by thermal sweating, that is evaporative heat loss, and this evaporation is only way to lose heat when air temperature exceeds the temperature of the skin. The assessment of adaptation of man of high altitude presents an interesting paradigm of dual problem delineating the actual pattern of structural, functional or behavioral response and evaluation of the adaptive value to a response based on the benefit of that response to the individual or population. The most apparent stresses for man at high altitude include hypoxia, high solar radiation, cold aridity, high winds, limited nutritional base and rough terrain. Of these, hypoxia is of predominant interest because the other stresses are present equally or in greater degree in other geographical zones. But hypoxia results from reduced barometric pressure at altitude stands alone. Now barometric pressure and the degree of hypoxia vary in different geographical locations at elevations that are comparable. Hypoxia is interesting to physiological anthropologists even though it affects only a small segment of the people. It is due to the fact that hypoxia is an ever-present stress which can be ameliorated by altering the behavioral pattern. It also affects all the organ systems and physiological functions of human body because there is loss of oxygen in the body. Even though hypoxia is present only at high altitude, it is encountered commonly at sea level. The evaluation of genetic basis for population adaptation to environmental stress is another reason for altitude effect studies on human population. Now, we will briefly describe the two important ecological rules here, and these rules we will discuss in detail in the next module too. So, First rule is Bergman's rule. Bergman in 1847 observed that the body size increases with decrease in the temperature of the habitat within a single polytypic warm-blooded species, while another scholar, Allen, in 1877 states that the mammals living in cold climates have smaller extremities and appendages than those who stay in the warmer climates. The aforesaid rules are applicable only when the species are subjected to wide range of climatic extremes and the species have not differentiated to the point where apparent thermoregulatory response is seen. The standard temperature trials include to explore the differences in group of people to heat adaptation. They are subjected to heat stress and their responses are compared, which is termed as the experimental approach, which this term was coined by Henschel in 1967. The skin temperature and some measures of internal temperature, rate of sweating, heart rate and oxygen consumption are used as measure of metabolic response in such studies. A combination of work and heat is utilized in most of these studies because this shortens the time period to achieve high level of protective response, that is production of sweat, since it imposes both an external and internal heat load. There are many factors that influence the performance of an individual in combination of heat and exercise, some of which are body size, state of heat acclimatization, state of physical fitness, nutrition or state of health, etc. Now we'll discuss about the acclimatization of temperature. Artificial heat acclimatization is a set of changes in response to controlled exposures of heat in extent of sweating production, changes in heart rate and changes in endocrine function brought about by loss of sodium contained in the sweat. These changes can be observed in healthy subjects exposed to a heat work situation after 5 to 10 days. The natural heat acclimatization is a thermoregulatory adaptation which requires frequent stimulation for full maintenance. Internal temperature does not show as much initial increase and level off or rise very slowly with the exposure. Sweat is produced sooner and reaches a high point earlier and is maintained at a constant rate for an extended period of time. Heart rate is not much increased as indicated earlier, that is primarily a function of exercise. Temperature of skin were reported to be lower in the acclimatization involving dry temperature or heat and higher in humid heat. Now, an additional change that occurs in heat acclimatization is the reduced concentration of salts, particularly the sodium chloride in each unit of sweat. But this is not of importance for assessing the effects of short-term exposure to heat because the higher production of sweat balance the decreased concentration of the salts. In 1966, Wyndham observed acclimatized Negroes having lower hours sweating rates than acclimatized Europeans, but when the group averages were collected for body weight or surface area, the differences diminished. This module has emphasized the uncertainties and the complexities involved in comparing different groups of people with respect to heat adaptation. A given population may have ignored or buffered the heat stress for generations or may have exploited maximum biological potential. The one way in which anthropologists can contribute to the understanding of temperature adaptation is by trying to identify the interface between what people can do and what they actually do, starting with the assumption that these parameters are not identical. Now, next aspect is how population adapting to the hypoxic condition. There are various methods of assessing adaptation to hypoxia. The basis for assessing human adaptation to hypoxia comprises of evaluation of relative benefit or degree of necessity to environmental stress. Adaptive implies selective advantage or fitness. The adaptive abilities of highlanders to lowlanders are enhanced ventilator efficiency or an increased work capacity. The adaptation at the individual level is assessing at adaptive domains which include physical performance like exercise and motor abilities or skills, functioning of nervous system like sensory, motor and neural functions, growth and development which include progression in the rate and attainment, nutrition which include requirements, utilization and efficiency, reproduction includes survival, reproductive advantage, health which have morbidity, mortality, resistance to diseases, cross tolerance and resistance, that is stress resistance, affective functioning and intellectual ability. The adaptation at the infra-individual level implies adaptation that is of benefit or necessity to the individual. This benefit or necessity is translated as homeostasis and resistance or tolerance. At high altitude, hypoxia produces stress at the beginning of oxygen transport chain. The response at infra-individual level are by increasing the oxygen transport at any level between the inspired air and tissue or by allowing function to continue despite lower oxygen tension. A cellular change that maintains the homeostasis is an infra-individual adaptation, but if it benefited the individual or population, then it is termed as individual or population adaptation. Now, another aspect we'll discuss about the problems in assessing adaptation to altitude. The assessment needs to examine relative benefit or necessity in an adaptive domain. It is not only sufficient to show that a response occurred or that individual and population differed in their responses, but rather some benefit has given. Large chest or high hematocrits in native highlanders are viewed as distinctive characteristics which are beneficial. For instance, hyperventilation, that is, it increased the oxygen transport, might be beneficial to individual or population without demonstrating advantage in any of the adaptive domains. Secondly, all phenotypic stable adaptive characteristics are not genetically adaptation. Acclimatization responses are far more vital than aptitudes in altitude hypoxia. The only common example of a hypoxic aptitude mistakenly considered as genetic adaptation is the large size of chest and large lungs. However, large chest and large lungs are mere ventilator acclimatization as hyperventilation. It is also essential to note that the adaptive benefit may be temporal, spatial, or population specific. For instance, those characteristics that occur with long-term exposure may not be beneficial in short-term exposure, and may be also harmful. In the first few days to months at altitude exposure, increased hypoxic sensitivity and hyperventilation is acclimatizational. A dimensioned hypoxic ventilator defect occurs during developmental period in long-term exposure. Hyperventilation would be advantageous to a population with a rightward shift on the hemoglobin dissociation curve, where arterial saturation is maximized by high alveolar oxygen tension, than to a population with leftward shift. Now, another aspect is organ system adaptation. A variety of responses enhance the oxygen transport or increase the resistance to hypoxia at organ system level. The only major aptitude considered important at organ system level in altitude hypoxia is a large chest and a large lung. Hurtado was of the view that it is not certain if this larger chest is directly associated with larger lungs, or whether larger lung volumes would be functionally important, because the Andean highlanders differ from lowlanders only in their larger lung residual volume. Therefore, a large chest cannot be assumed to be an adaptive aptitude, because it does not have a direct relation to increase the transport of oxygen. Now, there are following intra-individual adaptation to hypoxia, which are acclimatizational. The very first one is the red blood cells. It increases in the blood viscosity, may affect the flow of blood and circulation. Second is hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve. This curve shifts towards the decreased affinity, leading to enhanced release of oxygen to the tissue. This shift is more advantageous to the newcomers than the residents. The third one is circulation. There is increase in the cardiac output at rest during first days of exposure and then return to the normal levels. Such circulatory alterations such as reduced flow to kidney and heart occurs with greater flow to the muscle and brain. The fourth one is capillarity. Increase in the capillarity aids the process of diffusion in the tissue. Another point is ventilation. Among natives, resident and long sojourns, there is diminished hypoxic sensitivity and hyperventilation. Another one is cellular metabolism. There is higher concentration of muscle myoglobin and phosphates, which increases the activity of glycolytic and oxidative enzyme and enhance the aerobic glycolysis in the tissues of highlanders. These changes led to increase in resistance to tissues to low oxygen tension. Now, another aspect is individual adaptation. Here, the effect of individual adaptive domains are described like physical performance. Exposure to high altitude impairs physical abilities. The maximal work capacity of newcomers shows a decreasing trend, and maximal work become more stressful, leading to increase in the heart rate and rapid breathing, decreasing the endurance time. Decrease in aerobic capacity is directly proportional to the training extent. Athletes show greatest decrease, sedentary individual the least, and active individual the intermediate. Submaximal work at high altitude use a greater percentage of reduced capacity of total workload, which is known as relative workload. Now, highlanders have a slightly increased aerobic capacity at sea level, indicating that they have slight reduction in maximal performance at high altitude. The high endurance of submaximal work in them reveals their maximal capacity and the lower relative work at a fixed oxygen intake. This may be due to their small body build and their consequent usual activities involving moving of body weight and their endurance ability to work due to their vigorous activity level. We'll talk about the nervous system. The sensory and psychological performance where nervous system is susceptible to oxygen deprivation and functioning of sensory and motor system is not possible at altitude extremes. Now, development of central nervous system is delayed at high altitude. Brief anoxia in fetal stage cause damage and retardation of brain with late appearance. For example, Andean Guangzhou infants. Even at moderate altitude, visual and color sensitivity decreases. Growth and development. The organs such as lungs, heart and spleen gets reduced in weight although not proportional to the body weight, while thymus and kidney appears to be so much reduced. The reduction in hypoxia is due to reduction in number of cells with normal or large size of cells. The growth of genetically similar people is advanced in mountainous regions than the disease-prone lowlanders. There is relative increase in rate of growth of the chest in highlanders without functional importance to ventilator function. The reduced size of the body of the highlander may be beneficial during chronic food storage, famine or energetic of work. Then we can talk about the nutrition. People living in high altitude are subjected to seasonally deficient calorie and nutrient intake than the lowlanders. Acute exposure to hypoxia is associated with loss in the body weight, including loss of both water and tissues. Hypohydration and anorexia occurs at various degrees. We see negative balances of nitrogen and calories and other nutrients in response to extreme exposure, leading to reduced efficiency of food utilization. There is exposure of fat mobilization from the body, leading to increased serum free fatty acids. There is alteration of carbohydrate and protein metabolism as well. Now, in reproduction, there is effect of moderate altitude on reproduction during the first days or weeks of exposure. There is marked effect on litter size, birth weights, lactation, gonadal function and success of pregnancy due to exposure to the extreme altitudes. The adaptation to high altitude among neonates include increased placental size and vascularity and increased oxygen capacity of the fetal blood due to increase in mass of hemoglobin. Better care of neonates had led to lower the mortality in the United States. Another aspect is morbidity and mortality. Lack of medical facilities in high altitude regions has caused two problems. The first one is lack of adequate data on incidence of disease and cause of death, and the statistics that exist are biased by this lack of medical care in the region. And second is infectious diseases seems to be higher among the highlanders than the lowlanders. Altitude also has debilitating effects on lungs, thereby exacerbating pulmonary diseases. There is low incidence of chronic disease and hypertension of some altitude residents, which could be primarily due to genetic and dietary factors rather than of hypoxia. The pulmonary edema is the most severe of altitude sickness, which is characterized with the impaired exchange of pulmonary oxygen and pulmonary hypertension. Congenital abnormalities of different kinds appear to be more common at high altitude since these are marked by fetal anoxia. Now, another adaptation is cross tolerance and resistance. Humans exposed to hypoxia continuously or for a short period of time show enhanced responses and survive in more severe stress to hypoxia. The cross tolerance and resistance that occur in hypoxia are results of specific hypoxic responses rather than from general adaptation syndrome. In chronically exposed individual or severe stresses such as mountain climbing, adrenal activity and catecholamine appear normal. Increased vascularity affecting both capillary and large vessel occur in hypoxia, enhancing diffusion to oxygen to the cells. Till now we are discussing about the individual adaptation. Now we'll talk about population adaptation. Population adaptation is assessed in association to demographic optimality, spatial temporal spread, ecological efficiency and reproductive success. Infra-individual adaptations demonstrated among natives have made investigators view altitude native as an adapted individual and consider the population as also adapted. Humans have mildly impaired fertility in hypoxia, which is associated with increase in perinatal mortality, but there is no such mortality at moderate elevations. Census data show reduced reproductive success of native highlanders but enhanced reproductive success of the former, with sojourners indicated selective advantage of the former group. Now let us summarize what we have studied till now. The primary problem for man in hot environment is heat dissipation, and there are no major racial differences in the physiological mechanism which involved in dissipating heat. Man relies on the convection and radiation forms of heat loss up to the point when the surrounding air and objects become hotter than the skin. The adjustment of heat loss is accomplished by altering the flow of blood through the capillary bed of the skin by vasodilation or vasoconstriction. While exercising, heat is lost by thermal sweating, and this evaporation is the only way to lose heat when air temperature exceeds the temperature of the skin. The artificial heat acclimatization is a set of change in response to controlled exposure of heat in extent of sweating production, changes in heart rate and changes in endocrine functions brought about by loss of sodium contained in the sweat. The natural heat acclimatization is a thermoregulatory adaptation which requires frequent stimulation for full maintenance. Sweating is an efficient mechanism to maintain internal temperature only when the sweat can be totally evaporated as fast as it produced. Dripping sweat refers to the marked capacity of man to produce sweat more than can be evaporated on the skin. It is a maladaptive phenomenon unique to human. A given population may have ignored or buffered the heat stress for generations or may have exploited maximum biological potential. One way in which anthropologists can contribute to the understanding of temperature adaptation is by trying to identify the interface between what people can do and what they actually do, starting with the assumption that these parameters are not identical. The assessment of adaptation of man to high altitude presents an interesting paradigm of dual problem delineating the actual pattern of structural, functional or behavioral responses and evaluation of the adaptive value to a response based on the benefit of that response to the individual or population. The most apparent stress for man at high altitude include hypoxia, high solar radiation, cold, aridity, high winds, limited nutritional base and rough terrain. Of these, hypoxia is of predominant interest because the other stresses are present equally or in greater degree in other geographical zones. But hypoxia resulting from reduced barometric pressure at altitude stands alone. There is little or no benefit at altitude for any population. Some population may in fact be in the disadvantage. The high altitude population have different demographic structures, but their significance is unknown because of less studies conducted in those regions. Highlanders have survived of their own but have shown no relative benefit or advantage. Hypoxia is one of the environmental variables, and both the patterns and adaptive value of response is modified by the interaction of many environmental and cultural variables of the population. Thank you.